In this video we're going to be covering the digital frame paint features found inside Nuke. This is a good follow-up to the rotoscoping chapter because a lot of the principles that apply to the roto node will apply to the nodes we use for digital paint. In fact, the node that we primarily use for paint inside of Nuke is called the Roto Paint node. It can be found inside the Draw menu under Roto Paint. And so while Roto had the slightly less sensical hotkey of O, Roto Paint will have P for paint. Now before we get into paint ourselves, I'm just going to show you a pre-existing scene that I have. We've already used this scene in the rotoscoping chapter to show how we can combine two images using a mask. I'm also now going to show you how we can modify something within the frame. So we're actually now creating painted data inside the frame. In this example, we're going to be looking at this control panel wall right here. We had a bit of a texture problem in our render, and we want to be able to fix these without having to go back to our 3D package, re-render, fix textures, all those things. We can do it here once again, all in the composite. And you can see we already have a Roto Paint node connected, and let's go ahead and double click on that and see what we have. So the Roto Paint node looks very similar to the Roto node. We'll have a listing of all of our strokes, our paint strokes. You can see here we have 25 paint strokes in total. We have options as far as being able to animate and keyframe the strokes, and then we have many tabs for doing a variety of things, the familiar one being motion blur. And also, when we have our Roto Paint node open, we once again have additional toolbars visible in the viewer. Similar to the Roto node, we have our Select tool, a Pen tool, and a Bezier tool. So in that sense, the Roto Paint node can actually be used for Roto. The new tools we have are the Brush tool, which also has an eraser function. This allows us to paint solid colors onto the image. So an extension of the shapes that we can create with the Bezier tools. Here we have the Clone and Reveal tools, and these are the real powerhouse tools of the Roto Paint node. We also have tools for blurring, sharpening, and smearing the pixels on the image, and we have a tool for dodging and burning. In this example, you can see that the brush strokes that were set up for this existing node were clone stamps. So let me demonstrate to you real quick what that looks like. Go ahead and select the clone tool. You can see the hotkey for that is the C key. And before I start getting into painting, this would actually be a wonderful time to switch to one of our other layouts. We do most of our work when we're doing painting inside of the viewer, so we really don't need to give so much room for the node tree. So we'll switch to Layout 3, my default layer 3. And now we have a much larger area in which to do our paint. So the clone tool has all the same functions as a standard brush tool. Actually, it's a good place to start. We'll start with the brush tool. Just as a simple example, I'll select the brush tool. And with the brush tool selected, my options change along the top of the viewer. Here I have options for which color I'm going to be painting my brushstroke, what is the blending mode that the brushstroke is going to have, and the opacity. What is the size and hardness of the brush? And then what frame range is this brushstroke going to exist over? The default is a single frame, or the current frame that we're on. although we can have it extend to all frames in the sequence, all the frames from the start of the sequence to this frame, all the frames from this point till the end of the sequence, or we can enter in an actual numerical range. So this is a brushstroke that I want to be visible the entire time. So I will leave that at all frames, and I'll go ahead and click and drag on the viewer. Oh, I have to make sure that I have my view connected to the RotoPaint node. Do that one more time. Now when I click and drag in the viewer, I see a brushstroke coming from my mouse, and when I let go, I've created a new entry in the layer menu. I can, if I want to though at this point, switch over to my selection tool, and I can actually see the stroke that I just painted with my mouse. So this is one of the key things about the RotoPaint tool inside of Nuke. All of these brush strokes, even though we are changing pixel level data, they are all driven by vectors, by these mathematical splines, similar to the Bezier curves. So it becomes really powerful then we can go in and we see the individual points that make up this spline, and we can actually modify them after the fact. Now most of the time when you're doing detailed paint work like this, this is, for example, too many points to be really usable as far as modifying. But simpler shapes would be wonderful for this kind of modification. And we could do even simple things like using Control-A to select the entire drawing and move it around inside the frame, or rotate it, or scale it. So this is a really powerful feature of the RotoPaint node. Everything is editable, non-destructive. We can always go back and change something, even down to the color. If I select the color swatch inside the layer window next to the brushstroke, I can then go in and change the color of the stroke. So very powerful tool to paint, the brush tool. Most of the time we're not using the brush tool with a solid color. There would be a few exceptions where that would be necessary. Like I said, the main use of the RotoPaint node for VFX work is the clone brush. So I'll hit the C key, which is the shortcut key for that. And I get many of the same options, including the frame range, but then I have a couple of new options. For one, I have now a paint source. So whereas with the brush tool I primarily am painting with a solid color, here with the clone tool I am actually taking image data from inside of the current view and applying it somewhere else in the frame, hence the term cloning. So my options here are foreground, background, and then some other background options. If I wanted this tool to act just like a brush tool, then I could use a solid color. Foreground would simply be whatever the inputted image into the RotoPaint node is. Sorry, foreground would be the inputted image plus any existing paint strokes, and background would be the original image input into the RotoPaint node. So what does that mean exactly? Let's go ahead and create a paint stroke. So I'm going to do some keystrokes and explain them after I'm done. So with the clone brush tool set up, I'm just going to start painting. And you can see that I have cloned the window from this wall over to this wall. Now let's talk about the keystrokes I used, because when we are doing clone brush painting, it is very handy to know these shortcuts. As you can see, the clone brush tool actually has two circles that preview your brush stroke. The circle on the left represents where the image information we are cloning is coming from in the image. So here it's over the window. And then the circle on the right is where the image data is being cloned to. So that is where I am actually laying down the brush strokes. So from is the dim circle on the left, and to is the brighter white circle on the right. Now I can change the relationship of these two circles by holding the Control key and dragging. As I'm holding the Control key down, a solid line will appear between the two circles, and that allows me to freeze where the to circle is while I move my my brush circle. So for example, if I know I want to clone this poster somewhere, I would place my dim circle over the top of the poster and then drag to where I want the poster to be about. Put it down here. Then when I let go of the Control key, that relationship is set, and now I can just click to clone that data from one place to the next. Once again, as I'm making these brush strokes, they show up in the layer window. I can copy them, delete them, anything I'd like to do. The other keystroke that was important is changing the size of the brush. So for example, if I just want to clone this narrow railing, this is maybe too large of a brush. To change the size of the brush with a keyboard shortcut, we're going to use the Shift key. So we're going to use Shift and drag left and right to change the size of our brush. So here I'm holding the Shift key, and as I drag left and right, left makes it smaller, right makes it larger, and here I can make the brush just big enough to cover just that part, and then I can clone it somewhere else. Okay, so Shift for changing size, Control for changing the clone relationship. Two very powerful keyboard shortcuts to be aware of. So in this example, what has happened is, because of this texture error, our artists have gone in and used a RotoPaint node to clone out from image areas right next to the incorrect texture. And I can actually see a preview of all of those vector paint strokes by going to using the Select tool or the Pen tool, switching over to one of those other tools, the Select or the Pen tool. And with these options, I have the Show Paint Selection button. And this allows me to see all of the paint strokes within this RotoPaint node. So each one of these represents a different RotoPaint node stroke. And I can click them to select them. If for some reason I don't like where they are, I can move them by point, and I can see that the image data updates subtly, but it does update. So, very powerful way to change things after the fact. I'll go ahead and remove them just to show how quickly we can get rid of these errors. So I'll switch to my clone tool, make the brush size a little smaller, a little closer together. The brush is actually a little too soft, so I'm also going to change the hardness. A hardness of 0 is the softest brush possible. I can show that with a regular paint tool. So this is a brush with 0 softness, and this is a brush with 1. And you can see that that is a very hard edge. And then 0.5 would be somewhere in between. What's wonderful about the RotoPaint node inside of Nuke is that it works wonderfully with Wacom tablets or digitizing tablets, the pen type input devices. If you have access to one of these, you can see in the stroke tab option that we have the option to alter opacity, size, hardness, all with pressure sensitive digitizers. So if you have a Wacom or something like it, this is a great opportunity to use that. In fact, most artists who are doing digital paint are using these tablets. Even roto artists find themselves faster, or at the very least being able to more ergonomically use their hands quickly to do this type of work. Much easier than a mouse. I'm using the mouse though for the time being, so let's go ahead and go back to our cloning operation. So like I said, that was a little too soft, so I'm going to put it right around 0.2. And we can zoom in on a smaller area, and then we're going to use our Control key to get exactly the clone stroke that we want. That's a little too bright. Bring it over a little bit more. You can see I'm going over the line twice. Maybe I could make my brush a little wider, but for now this is fine. So I'm just looking for areas that match closely the color that I'm trying to remove here. This whole area has to change. Now you can start seeing the problem with using stroke set to foreground. If I make a mistake in my painting, even though I know underneath the stroke is a darker color, if I try to stroke here, it actually takes my existing paint strokes and uses that as a clone source. If I set this to background, however, it will use the original underlying imagery instead, and I'll get a much cleaner paint result. So a lot of times when we're creating clean plates and painting out material, we want to try to use the background setting or the unadulterated input. Okay, there's still some problem areas, but I just want to give you an idea of what the tool is capable of. So you can see how, as I enable and disable this RotoPaint node, how effective this tool can be for cleaning up plates, modifying footage, all sorts of things. However, just as we did with the Roto node, this is only a single frame, and the RotoPaint node becomes much more powerful when we are dealing with a range of frames. So let's talk about using a frame range. Here we have some footage that doesn't have too much camera motion, but it does have a range of frames. So I'm going to use this little section where Connie Radar turns her head as a preview of one of the most useful features of the RotoPaint node. I'm also going to switch this to our more paint-friendly layout. So I'm going to add a RotoPaint node with the P key. And instead of the clone tool, I'm going to use its sister tool, which is called the reveal tool. And the reveal tool, you see if I switch between these two with the hotkey C, the main difference is the addition of this time delta option. And this has a text entry box and then a drop down that gives me the option of relative and absolute. The main difference between the clone tool and the reveal tool is that the clone tool is made for painting pixels from one area of a frame to another area of a frame on perhaps the same frame. The reveal tool is all about painting across time. If you have a clip that has changing imagery over time, you can use the reveal tool to paint pixels into a frame in the future or the past. So, what do I mean by that? Well, we'll start with the drop-down. The options here are pretty simple. Absolute means whatever I type in here will be the actual frame that the brush tool pulls from. So I have my frame numbers down here in the timeline. I could type in 1020 and it would come from this frame. Or I can use the option to do relative. Relative will be in relation to the current frame. How many frames forwards or backwards do you want to go? And what's interesting about relative is this changes as your frame range changes. So essentially, your image is updating because it's going through the timeline, but your paint strokes are also updating because they are relative to that current frame. So let's try that out. I'm going to go ahead and use this simple motion of returning your head to show what's going on. If I'm at frame 1020 and I say relative to this frame, go paint from 10 frames ahead, I can then go into this part of the image. I'll make my brush bigger with Shift, and I'm going to go ahead and start painting. Oh, I failed to change one thing here. Just like the clone tool, I have to choose where the source is coming from, foreground or background. I'll go ahead and do the background, which is just, once again, the original image that's coming into the RotoPaint node. Alright, so 10 frames in the future, what does that look like? Well, how about that? 10 frames in the future, her head was turned. So as I paint over this part of the frame, I am essentially painting in the part of the image that is 10 frames ahead of the current frame. And what's great is, once again, as I scroll my playhead, right now I have it only set to be a single frame where it's painting from the future. So the very next frame it goes back to being just normal frame 1021. But if I set this reveal paint stroke and I change its lifetime to be all frames, now as I scrub forward, those paint strokes are updating to frames in the future. Here's one that I missed. Oh, I have to make sure that one is set to all time. Here's some that I missed. Instead of changing that each time, I can change from single frame to all frame here for the default. So every time I create a stroke now, it'll be in for all frames. And you can start to see where it breaks down, because once again, this is a bit of an odd example of why we'd be painting these things. But if I disable it, you can see this is what frame 1038 actually looks like, and my paint strokes are coming from 1048, which should match that frame right there. So this can be a powerful feature if, for example, you have a person walking across the screen, and in frame 1 they're standing in front of something, but by frame 2 they've moved forward. You could use the reveal tool to paint over them based on the area that they previously were in. So painting across time is very powerful. So clone tool, painting within a frame, and reveal tool, painting across time. It's a clone tool for time. There's a few other examples of things that you might find useful to do in a image like this. With our brush tool, for example, maybe we want to paint out this light stand instead of doing an alpha channel for whatever reason. Remember, we can set a color here. We can use the color picker tool if we really want to. Try to find a green that's close, or we can click on the color swatch, and now we're in color sampling mode. And now I can control click in the frame somewhere over this red dot, and then my color's red, over the green screen, and then my color's green, and I'm sampling. Or I can average some frames by control shift clicking and dragging a sample box, and it'll sample all the color pixels within this box and give me a color. Click that again to turn off the sampling, and now I have it disabled. And now my paint strokes are pretty darn close to the color of that green screen. Down here maybe it's not exactly right, so I can resample, and I can get that color exactly right. So that's one example of what we can do with just a normal brush tool. The brush tool is not limited to painting in RGB space, though. We can also use the brush tool to paint inside the alpha channel. One extreme example of this is when rotoing a human head with wispy hair. You might use the roto tool inside of Nuke to actually keep disabling it. Sorry, you might use the Roto Paint tool for actually painting inside of the alpha channel. I actually had this working. I'm going to make sure I have this working before I go on. I'm going to pause here and stop in a second.